Good afternoon, everyone. Today is April 30th, 2024. This is a City Council of Prescott 1 p.m. study session. Roll call, please.
Mayor Good.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Cantelmi.
Here.
Councilwoman Freeworth.
Present.
Councilman Gambogi.
Here.
Councilman Montoya.
Here.
Councilmember Rusing.
Here.
And the record will reflect that Councilman Moore is excused from the meeting.
Thank you, City Clerk. Will you read the discussion title?
Certainly. Presentation and discussion regarding Prop 478, a proposed transaction privilege tax for the purposes of public safety within the city related to options for ballot language and percentages.
Thank you, Sarah. Mayor, Council, we're here today to continue the discussion we started on April 9th on the public safety needs and the different financing options. We're going to go through the sheets, several of the sheets you saw on the 9th. There's a couple new ones. Going to talk about the different options that we're presenting. Some work, some don't work. We'll talk about that. The overall goal of where we need to end up with today is to settle on what council wants to do. If council wants to bring this to the November election, we need to have direction on which ballot language to bring back to council on the 14th of May so that we can get that all moving forward. With that, we will go start through these wonderful slides. The first two slides are the capital needs as brought forward by our two chiefs. And then the next one is the operating needs over this 10-year period of planning. These, again, are the same as we saw on the 9th. They have not changed. If you have any questions on those, we could take those now and have the chiefs respond. I think Councilwoman
Freeworth.
Thank you, Mayor. I do have a question. If I understand from folks in the county, they're initiating a project about a call center. I don't know if it's a project. I don't know if it's an initiative. But the question I have, is there anything in here that we are including in our either capital or operating needs that might be affected by however that project moves forward? Not that I'm going to judge one way or the other. I just want to know.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I can speak to that, and if Chief Bonnie has any other details, she can add those. But yes, we are going to be participating in a discussion of feasibility study for regionalizing dispatch. That will be a discussion going forward that we will have representation at. Currently, the projected operating and capital needs do not contemplate moving our dispatch, adding to it an integrate amount. So those numbers are not incorporated in this information before you.
Councilman Gambogi.
Mark, could you go back to the capital needs? In fiscal year 2, we got 2 fire stations at $10 million a pop. And then in fiscal year 4, you got a additional facility for police at $28 million. Are any of those combined, and why is the police facility more expensive than a fire station?
We'll let the chiefs respond, I guess. In short, I think a lot of it has to do with the size and the functionality of those different facilities.
Thank you. That's a good question. Absolutely. It has to do with size and scope. Police stations require additional security that fire stations don't necessarily require. So the facility we're talking about is going to be significantly bigger than a standalone fire station.
And is this any of these is co-located with fire?
This facility particularly, no. We certainly could look at if they want some office space. What we have spoken with fire about is when they build a new fire station, giving us some space in there sort of as a substation. but that won't meet our overall long-term need.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilman Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a question kind of along Ted's lines regarding the additional, the remodel of Station 77 being a little bit more costly than the other existing stations. And I'm sure there's a reason. I guess I'm just curious what that reason might be.
Well, 77 is not a remodel. That's a new station.
Okay.
In the 7th year is the design and land acquisition, I believe, and in the
that makes sense.
8th year is the construction.
Okay. So the design and planning of that is going to cost $4 million.
And land.
And land acquisition.
And land, yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
And again, a lot of what everything we talk about today are projections. I mean, they're obviously educated projections, the best that we can do, but they are projections. We can't tell you exactly what a fire station constructed 8 years from now is going to cost, but we can only project. All right. As we move on, we looked at 3 different taxing scenarios that has been discussed by council. The first one, and these you've seen, I believe, this one before. I've rearranged it to try to make some points a little clearer. I've also highlighted the new tax so it's a little clearer which one is the new tax and which one are existing revenues there. This is a 0.75% tax with no sunset. This would be ongoing to fund public safety. It would require a significant amount of capital, about 70 million, 67.5 million estimated of financing of that capital because of the cash flows, which would cost a significant amount of interest. And if we look at this graph, this is a graph with that red didn't come out red on the overhead, did it? Fire's supposed to be red, but we'll go with orange. PD operations and fire, as we build these facilities, as we try to improve response times and better coverage, operating costs are increasing, and those are those 2 lower graphs. Then we have cash-funded capital, which is signified by the checkered brick-like looking pattern there, and then we have debt service on financed capital needs. The capital needs I've spread out over the period of available funding. Obviously, there'll be spikes. You'll build it 1 year, the next year you'll recover some of that cash or accumulate some of the cash for the next year. Smoothed it out to make it a clearer point. The black dotted line that everything is falling under until you get to the outer years is the projected sales tax revenue from the 0.75%. As you can see, 0.75 doesn't work to cover both the capital as well as the operating. As we get out into year 8, the annual expenses are exceeding the projected revenue from that, as well as the other projected revenues. The next option we looked at was a 0.8% tax with no sunset. And again, the same spreadsheet pattern here with the new tax being in blue. The amount of debt on the bottom, you can see a little less debt with this one, 56.5 million issued, because again, more revenues are coming in so we can cash fund more of it. Reduces the overall interest costs over the 30-year period and helps give you a little more to cover the operating costs. Again, the same colors here for operations and everything. As you can see, the dotted line, still has capital exceeding slightly in that outer year, which isn't great. But again, it's a projection 10 years from now. It's going to fluctuate. Interest rates might not be as high as we projected. Sales tax increases could be better than we projected. So the little bit of exceeding revenues here is not a huge concern for me 10 years out. It is a tax that would work. However, it would require a significant debt issue, significant interest costs being paid out over time. The next, this next graph was something Councilman Gambogi was interested in seeing, so we put it together. It kind of summarizes the two different parts of these expenditures. It puts all the operations together and all the capital, which includes the debt service capital, together to show more of a trending. So I included it in the presentation since it was something we put together for.
Councilman Gambogi, you had another question?
Just to recap, at 0.75, we're about $4 million in the hole at the end of the program period.
Exceeding each year as you look at that, if you look at that table, I'll just flash back to it here. You can see, those of you with better eyes than me can see, we're, in fiscal year 23 or 33 up there, we're negative 1.8 for operations. The next year it goes to 3.26. Again, it's that increased debt service from this scenario, and the just lack of the tax being available at 0.75.
And at 0.8, we just about break even.
0.8's a lot closer to achieving it. We don't start to get in that negative position until year 10. And again, these are projections. The only thing I can guarantee you about these projections is they're not going to be absolutely correct. They'll be one way or another.
Councilwoman Furworth.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't care if you stick on the 0.75 or the 0.8 slide. I want to talk about the line of development impact fees.
Yes, ma'am.
So I can see from comparing it to previous meetings that we are counting here on increasing our impact fees.
Yes, and these are, again, our projections. If you'll see in the first year, which here is 2025, based on what council has expressed the desire to go in November, we're using the accumulated balance in our fire and our police impact fees, which is 3.2 million, 3.18.
Which is 1.6. You've told us that in the past. One
Roughly in
per
each
fire,
of them,
per
yeah.
Police, okay.
But then each year we're projecting that the impact fees that come in would be used to cover the debt service that was used to construct the facilities. So that is a projection of what the new impact fees would bring in. Again, all of this is projection. Whatever the impact fees bring in is what will be able to be used, whether it's higher or lower than that.
Granted. And if I compare the starting off of fiscal year 26, the 530, 400,000, how does that compare? I thought our numbers previously were about half of that per year.
They are
So
currently.
if since 2019 to 2024, we've doubled the ability to have impact fees, could we or should we even think about doing that going forward in the projections as we go out? I'm trying to figure out if any of this could possibly help us close the negative numbers that we're seeing where the ongoing costs exceed and I would think impact fees for police and fire should be keeping up with the pace of our costs.
Well, they are keeping up with the pace of the capacity that you're adding. The rules established by the state legislature limit a lot of what you can do on assessing impact fees. When we work to put these together, and again, these are estimates still, the square footage that is being constructed through this plan, this 7-year plan, was included in the discussion with the consultants. That square footage is needed for that future growth, not just this 10-year period, but even beyond that. So, no, you're not going to, in my opinion, unless the state changes the laws, you're not going to see another doubling of the public safety impact fees. The square footage that is projected in this capital plan is what police and fire say is needed for the foreseeable build out of the city of Prescott. So that square footage is going to be what is allocated to new development as they come in.
Okay, but I'm not understanding.
Impact fees do not pay operating costs.
I understand that.
So by year 8, all the construction is done.
But we're counting on a fire station 77, is that?
Yes.
77 is out there thinking that all these homes are going to be built in the north in the future.
Yes.
So
So
we
that
counting
square
on all those
feet
homes?
is the square footage of all these facilities is what was allocated for the build out of the community. So that's how the calculation was made.
And I'll chime in if I could. That
Thank you.
Station 77 is included in those increased development impact fee projections. That is already included in these slides that you're seeing now. However, it's every 5 years that we reassess the infrastructure improvement plan, the land use assumptions. But with that said, to Mark's point, what has been projected for police and fire build out is currently contained in these numbers. Now, it might change in 5 years when we reassess things, but for now, all of the stations, all the capital needs that are related to growth are built in to those numbers.
And again, that is why they're not going to go up dramatically, because all the future square footage needed for new development is included in these numbers.
Thank you. So if that future square footage doesn't materialize, if the growth of these neighborhoods takes another decade beyond this, I just want to understand the risks and the assumptions more clearly on how we got to this than I do today. So,
And again, that is always a risk when you build facilities. If you think the growth will never come, obviously the facility should not be built. But you can't
well,
build.
that's black and white, and we live in a world of gray.
Exactly. So you can't build half a station. So if you need the station, you build the full station, and you assume growth will come. Whether it gets delayed a year or two or comes a year or two sooner doesn't really matter once the square footage is there to serve that new development.
And that you're entitled to that opinion. I'm trying to find, if the growth doesn't come and we do not have to build that fire station on this timing, where are the puts and calls of this analysis? And I'm not sure I understand that.
If it doesn't come, there's a couple of complicating factors with impact fees. The ones that we collect for that purpose, for Station 77, let's take that for the example, would have to be spent within 10 years. Now, they can be used for debt service, and it's a little more complicated than I'm making it right here. But assuming it didn't happen, there may be an element of refunding, which is not something we've ever had to face or talk about. But knowing Prescott and knowing what has been annexed, what has been provided as far as growth and where and what's entitled, I think we're pretty confident in saying that these stations and facilities will be needed in this time frame that we're showing. Short of that, we can pivot and make adjustments. It's something the city's never had to face before with impact fees, but it can be done.
Yeah, I don't want to misconstrue the fact that I'm absolutely for the sales tax increase. We've got to do something. I'm just trying to find for the councils that are sitting out here 7, 8 to 10 years from now, where are the puts and calls that they may have to make based upon how growth and the economy, and I'm sure later on, in our projections here for sales tax, we could be higher, we could be lower. So I get it, it's all projections, and I just wanted to make sure I understand what are the puts and calls in the future out years that are risks or opportunities, one or the other.
Well, and not to complicate this factor, because we actually are going to have several workshops on this over the next 2 months. Public safety approach, there's two different approaches you can use in establishing impact fees allowed in the state law. One is a strict CIP program where I'm going to build X, I'm going to accumulate money for X, I'm going to build X. That leads you into the potential refunds if that project doesn't happen. The capacity approach, which is what we took in public safety for the very reasons that you're pointing out here, was to see our existing capacity, how many fire, and we'll simplify, I mean, I'm not a rate consultant, but we'll simplify it. How many fire station square footage do we have now? What do we need for a growth level? We divide that out to get how many square footage each new residential unit needs to pay for in a fire station, okay? So whether that's 100 square feet or whatever it is, that's calculated as part of the rate study. We're going to look at it on the 15th of May and on the 9th of July. And that is how it's assessed. So if the growth doesn't happen and we're sitting here 8 years from now, probably not all of us, but other people will be, they can push that station off if the growth hasn't happened. It doesn't have to be built in year 77, or 77 built in year 8. Too many numbers. It can be pushed off without causing a thing because of the way we decided to do the rate study on a capacity basis, not on a strict CIP basis.
And I just think this is also important later on when we get to talking about the language on the ballot measure in terms of dates and sunsets and all those kind of things. So I just wanted to have a much more clearer understanding of the out years before giving you guidance later today.
Yes, and I think that's an excellent point. I mean, it's a good point that we should discuss. So thank you for bringing it up.
Mayor Pro Tem.
So, Mark, I also want to talk about this impact fee thing because
Okay.
I've done quite a bit of research on this, and I've paid impact fees for 40 years in my career. Just correct me if I'm wrong, as this is my understanding right now. This $3 million that you have there, it's the impact fee money that you currently have, that you have collected.
Yes.
Okay, so we currently have that amount of money in an account somewhere.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the impact fees going forward, just for the benefit of the public and Lois, we cannot retroactively put an impact fee on the 10,500 homes at Deep Well Ranch. That ship has sailed. We cannot do
They're
that.
You're having an impact fee assessed on them.
But there's
And
two.
yes, we can do it on the ones that have not been permitted.
Okay.
You only pay impact fees at the time of permit.
Okay, but what I'm saying, there are two impact fees. One is for underground infrastructure, and one is for structural, the above ground impact fee.
For underground being water and wastewater,
Correct.
structural being,
Right.
yes.
So I have a study that says, even though it was changed in 2012, and I've heard people say that a bunch of times, it was modified. And if you read the legal framework for the latest, did you guys read that impact fee? I gave that to you. So it's my understanding from this study that was very well researched and legally defensible, by the way, because there was a case already going against it from a municipality, that in 2018, because of the change, you do not have to spend that money in 10 years anymore, number one. Number two, the impact fee can be charged for any permit at the time, but you cannot retroactively go back. But you can also designate that fee for fire and police. And I have a copy of that. I thought I sent it to you, the modifications. So have you looked into the modifications in 2018?
So that's what we do, is assess impact fees at time of permit. There are impact fees specific for police and fire, which still have the 10-year basis based on state law in Arizona. And the underground that you referred to, the water and the wastewater, have a 15-year basis. Now, that is a basis in calculating when the projects are built, but impact fees can also be used to pay debt service. So if you get debt service, accumulate debt service on several $1 million worth of public safety facilities, and you pay that for 30 years, you can collect those fees even beyond that 10-year period. Does that clarify it? I guess I don't understand what difference you're trying to point out.
Well, because we don't have the structural impact fee, we're having
We do have
a structural impact fee, our study. You said it was coming up on.
We have impact fees in place. The study that is happening now is to update those impact
Right.
fees.
So they will change, and presumably they're going to go up.
Whatever council decides to do.
Okay. So that, but what I wanted to also understand on your spreadsheet, when we're accounting for the $3,180,000, that was money that you already had.
Correct. That is what has been accumulated and not spent over the last 30 years.
Right. So when you've got in that same line, as it goes down to 530,000, 541, that is not accounting for our eventual rate study that may actually raise.
It is taking an estimate on a new rate study, bringing those up. It's also taking an estimate on the number of new permits that will be pulled over that period of time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I just wanted an understanding of that because.
Oh, absolutely. Are we clear? I guess I'm not sure I'm clear.
Yeah, there's another point, but I want to go back and read the study about the legal framework in terms of what I read. And Joe, did you interpret that in the same way?
Are you talking about the 10-year requirement?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's really kind of resting on a technicality on the 10-year requirement. There is a 10-year requirement. I think we can just state that, and that's the end of it. Now, what that study says, and I think would probably be upheld in court, is that if the money is not spent in 10 years, but you still have the plan to do so, you can extend that out a certain period of time.
Right. Well, and again, I think the point is this infrastructure will probably be mostly built in the next 8 years, and we'll be paying debt service for years beyond that. So I don't think the 10 years is a significant issue as far as having to get it all spent.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. When we go to the ballot box and ask the public for a tax increase, they need to be able to trust us. They need to be able to trust that we're going to do what we say we're going to do. And I was under the impression from our previous study session that these public safety tax dollars were going to go into a separate dedicated fund, not into the general fund. That's the also the feedback that I've gotten from some taxpayers, that they would be a lot happier knowing that it was going to be dedicated solely to public safety and not go into the general fund. And I didn't see that in any of the drafts.
Well, it's definitely dedicated to public safety. The issue is this tax on its own will pay less than half of the cost of public safety. So what would you put in that separate fund? A random picking of half the cost, leaving the other half in the general fund. It will be in the general fund. It will be accounted for as going to public safety. It will be presented in the budget each year as part of the public safety thing. This is different than the PSPRS tax, which had a specific purpose, and that's what it was for. You collected it, you sent it. This is being collected because of the 30-some million that we spend in the general fund each year is not sufficient. So 10 years from now, when we're spending $50 million a year on public safety, only $20 million is coming from this tax. You know, I guess that's the issue. That's why it was designated in the general fund to be used for public safety, but it's part of the funding pie that covers public safety.
So thank you very much for clarifying that.
You know, Chief Bonney, I still have a question on this nearly $29 million extra facility. I certainly understand that additional security is needed at a police station than a fire station, but 3 times the cost. If this is a substation, or are you relocating the primary police station completely
we would
and
be
building a
looking
whole new
at
building?
consolidating our property and evidence facility, which right now is primarily located at our main station on Marina Street. We've exceeded the capacity of that facility and have sort of scattered our property and evidence around the city. So building a purpose-built building with additional police space for moving some of our operations out of the downtown to allow us for that increased staffing is really what we'd be looking at. So an additional building with some additional training rooms. It is significantly bigger than a standalone fire station.
So just in square footage,
Yes.
so obviously evidence and material like that has to be very, very well secured.
It has to be secured. It has to be temperature controlled. We're talking about securing things like firearms, drugs like fentanyl, having space.
You have rape kits in there too?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, they definitely have to be protected from being degraded over long periods of time, right?
Correct.
And Mayor, if I could, and Chief, you can maybe give more detail to this, but the police department did go through a space needs assessment or analysis, which fed into this information and then contributed to the number, which we based off of square footage costs for current construction of police facilities, which, as you can imagine, has only gone up exponentially in the last few years. So it's based on the needs analysis that they're projecting as a department over the next 10 years, and it's informed through an architect and based on kind of the trends as well as what we're lacking today.
Remind us, you told us that square footage.
30,000 square feet is built into that number.
Yes.
And what's a typical fire station? 14, so that's double right there alone. Yeah, I would recommend that that study be included in the public information packet. So if anybody else looks at this, like just at the numbers, they're going to be scratching their heads too. And I think being able to have that justified requirements included would be very helpful. Councilmember Furworth.
Thank you, Mayor. One more question regarding police.
That's why I sat on the end.
Smart lady. So we now understand the 28.9 out in fourth year. How do I think about that in relation to the expenditure in fiscal year 1 and 2 with that property and evidence facility? Are those going to be one complex, or are those going to be in separate facilities, or that's the growth? How do I think about that?
What I would hope for and what we would anticipate is to build the initial property and evidence facility with the capacity for additional space for that police, for our police facility. So hopefully one facility, conceptually, we have discussed with the county, perhaps sharing a facility with them out near the Justice Center. So there's all sorts of possibilities, but conceptually building that property and evidence facility first with the ability to add on to it for.
And the adding on is what our needs are, is that 28.9 later on, regardless of what happens with the county or whatever.
Yeah,
That's our needs.
Yes.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. The final projection of a tax rate that we did was with a portion of the tax being sunset after a period of time. We looked at a 0.95%, which would sunset 0.2 of that, and hopefully 2035, bringing the tax rate down to 0.75. Remember, the 0.75 on its own did not work. But this would work. Again, I projected this one out of 14 years instead of 10, just so that you could see kind of the life of that initial tax and where it would end up after. In this scenario, we obviously have a lot of cash-funded capital. We have debt service. We did a 10-year amortization of that debt so we could get this item sunset, as opposed to the others, which were 30 years. So again, same colors, except the fire came out right on this one. I'm not quite sure why it's not orange. Fire is always a problem. So as we go out, you can see the initial tax is significantly high at the 0.95. When we sunset that December 31st of 2035, it drops to 0.75, which is just in time to pay off all the cash-funded capital and the debt service. That debt service would be retired. And then the 0.75, which is sufficient for just the operating portion, would continue on. And again, significantly reduced operating costs related to the debt service, 6.6 million instead of 44 million. So you save 38 million just in interest cost. It has a lot of advantages. Obviously, a big disadvantage of a higher tax rate for the initial 10 years. But with that, we went ahead with our projection that we do. I only graphed on here Prescott at the 0.8 and Prescott at the 0.95, reducing to the 0.75. Just to give you an idea of how we would line up with the other communities around us. Again, with that, I've put some ballot language from the ordinances supplied by the city clerk to put up on the screen to talk about. Again, I only did the two that will work, the 0.8 continuous or the 0.95 with the sunsetting at 0.2. Again, with that, I have those two slides if council wants to discuss it or question it or change it or what we want to go.
You know, Mark, I'd like to see a per capita analysis of the CAFMA charges for property tax in Prescott Valley, because their fire service is provided by CAFMA. It's not paid by a sales tax. It's paid by a property tax. And I think when the average person is comparing sales tax comparison, they're going to say, well, Prescott Valley is way lower if we adopt this tax. But if we were able to show the per capita cost that the homeowners are paying for CAFMA fire protection, I think they'd see it's quite a bit higher.
And again, we have that chart we use all the time. Is that the one you're referring to where we show what the city tax rate and the other? I don't have it in this PowerPoint, but we can sure get that for council again. It'll be part of our budget workshop coming up next week, 2 weeks.
Chief Dura, where
Next
do you
week.
anticipate that this additional fire station 77 would be located? I know originally there was discussion about possibly Harris Park, but I think if we're going to talk about land acquisition to cover Deepwell Ranch, additional residential development, and also Arizona Eco Development north of 89A.
Yeah, and if you give me the permission real quick, I want to kind of back into that because I think it's a really good framing for the conversation that we're having. The initial upfront in years 1 through 3 don't require any additional staff to serve North Prescott. I've heard that as a feedback. The new staff would serve Central Prescott around Prescott Lakes and Roster Drive, as well as some significant investments into Station 72 to take care of the core of town. And the reason why I bring that up is because we are relocating Station 73 up north with existing personnel to leverage that efficiency of the resources we already have. And you're absolutely correct. Station 77 is that far out because we want to understand better where AED, the eco-development, the potential for a Banner Hospital north of the airport, all of that development occurs so that we can leverage a lot of things. Number one, placing a 50 to 75-year capital decisions in the correct location to have the maximum effect, but also at the same time to see if there's private-public partnerships, other cooperative agreements that we could potentially leverage that we just don't have the ability to see yet right now. So absolutely, you're 100% correct. Station 77 in the out years is to respond to that growth up north and put it in the most appropriate location at that time, since we don't understand exactly what that looks like today.
Well, as more development occurs up there, I think the value of the land is going to escalate as well. So if we're going to need, 4 acres?
3 to 4, yep.
I mean, acquiring 4 acres somewhere in that vicinity now, and if it turns out that the location maybe is not ideal, then we could potentially sell that 4 acres at a much escalated price and acquire another 4 acres at a more ideal location without a huge gap in acquisition costs for the property.
I think that's a smart approach based on even the way that we're projecting the capital construction on the stations that we need now to do them simultaneously under one construction contract and leveraging the cost savings. That strategy would actually align very well with that same philosophy of if you know you're going to need it, you might as well get your placeholder in, and something we could certainly consider if city management, legal, and finance can find a way to make that happen. I would be completely okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, that acquisition cost is in this plan, but it's way down the road. So if we could forward that acquisition earlier in those fiscal years, then we only have to worry about actually building the eventual fire station. So it's just a matter of moving it to a different fiscal year location, right?
Right. I mean, and again, these are projections. These will be part of the capital plan that we review each year as part of our budget process. And if the council wants to move something forward, we move something forward. If not, we move it out. So yeah, it's a great point, Mayor. But it's something that'll be done every year. It'll be reviewed and adjusted to the appropriate year that it would belong in.
So Chief, we are 2 fire stations short right now.
Correct.
So relocating 73 to a more appropriate location south of the airport, but still being able to access the runways
Yes.
is not a new station. It's just relocating and then, of course, the remodeling of it.
Yeah.
And then 76 would be a new station,
Correct.
and that's what we're expecting to possibly build over on Rosser.
Yes, sir.
So 77, eventually, when that's done, that should get us back to where we should be right now.
Well, that's a very good point. So that's also the reason why we're looking at investing into Station 72 with our low acuity initiatives, because that's the existing call volume, because it's not just growth and covering the geography, it's also covering the volume and the increase in responses here in the downtown area. And so it's kind of a 1-2. It's sort of, Mark mentioned a half a fire station. In a way, that's almost a half a fire station approach if you think about it, because we're putting some capital resources and firefighters in the downtown area to look at that low acuity increase. And we're also putting firefighters up north and relocating the ones that we have to more efficiently service what we have, because I do believe the plan that I've proposed does help us over the next 7 years to be able to allow that development to happen while understanding where that second fire station does need to go. But you're absolutely correct. Based on drive times, based on projected increases on the neighborhoods that we see reasonably happening, yes, we will need that second fire station. But we also need to continue to lean into smart and innovative response services, which is why Station 72 is a focal point right up front.
Thanks, Chief.
You bet.
Councilman Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. I had a question kind of regarding the proposed sunset and the ongoing ballot language. I guess one of my questions is, I know that this kind of is tied to the retiring of the debt service that's associated with that. Is that kind of what you envisioned with the sunset, Mark?
Yes. The point was in response to council's desire to have a portion of it sunset and to not spread out the debt issues so far, was to have this option.
And so I guess kind of thinking this through, like my understanding is 10 is probably the lowest you can go on a debt issuance for a municipality.
Generally, yes.
And I imagine, we wouldn't have a call option on that essentially to make it callable. That's not something we would want to do necessarily.
Yes, at a 10-year final maturity, a call option would cost you.
Yeah, and
meaning you could do it, but you might pay another percent.
Yeah, and so I guess the reason I'm thinking about this, because I know when we were looking at when 443 came around, it had a 10-year sunset, and then obviously we were able to retire it in half that time. And I'm just trying to think if there's a trigger that might be able to make this a little bit more palatable to people, where we could find a way to sunset it before 10 years, or if there was some optionality there that might exist. Or if you contemplated that and maybe didn't get to it for some reason. I'm just thinking out loud.
And again, I mean, you stated it relatively clearly in our debt market, where we have to issue bonds. We can't take out a mortgage. Government property cannot be levied. So anything we issue has to be a bond, a pledge of a revenue. Those things are very expensive with issuance costs up front. And if you go any shorter than 10 years, they get to be a relatively expensive way to finance things. 10 years worked out pretty well on the cash flow.
It certainly looks like that on the cash flow and in the graphical representation. And I'll be honest, I was I've previously been a little bit skeptical of proceeding with a sunset because part of me was concerned that it would appear as if we were doing a gimmick of raising it artificially and then cutting it down. But in what you're showing, it actually the reason we're creating a sunset is not just to be able to say, yay, we sunsetted part of the tax. It's to say we saved a significant amount of money in debt issuance. I mean, that's dramatic. And I think that's a big part of the narrative that we need to get out to the public around why the sunset is there, and how it functions. I would love nothing better than Cindy to use your little graphic with the bricks and the paper tomorrow. So, Cindy. The other thing I want to mention to the mayor's point about PV taxes and the per capita with CAFMA, it occurs to me, I've talked to friends who I have a commercial building in Prescott, and I have a friend who has a commercial building in Prescott Valley, approximately the same size. And my sense is that he's paying double his property tax to what I'm paying. And I think a big portion of that is CAFMA, sales or property tax. I also know that when 443 got done, my wife and I sat down and did the calculation. Granted, this was back in 2016, but the effective increase based on what our spending habits were on 0.75 was about $300 for a family of four on an annual basis. And I have been telling folks, as I think we've all been talking to a lot of folks about this tax issuance, I paid $30,000 in federal taxes last year. I don't know exactly what I got for that $30,000, but I did pay it. If you asked me to pay another $300 or even $400, or if 0.95 worked out to $500 or $600, I asked my wife to run the math. She hasn't done it yet. But if, let's say it's $600 and I get 2 or 3 fire stations out of that, that's a heck of a deal from where I sit. So I think that's also a compelling story to be able to tell as we go and talk to friends and neighbors and constituents about this, is that, this is a pretty good deal for dealing with, what's a really kind of emerging issue in our community to drive down response times. I have a question for you, Fire Chief Dura, if I could. You touched on something a moment ago regarding low acuity. And I guess part of what I think of is sometimes we're sending a fire truck out to like a situation that doesn't necessarily warrant a fire truck, right? And I'm thinking of a situation where someone has a heart attack. You want to have a paramedic show up there to kind of back up, EMS service and that kind of thing, but you don't need, you don't need the full works of what a fire truck brings. And I think there's 2 pieces, and I think you've talked about this a little bit with low acuity. I guess one of them is looking at having different response capacity to your half a fire station kind of idea a little bit. But I wonder if there's not also an educational piece about low acuity where we can talk to people in the community. When is a good time to call, 911? I have a neighbor with a dog that barks a lot, and I didn't call 911 because I know that there's a number to call for barking dogs that isn't 911. Can you speak to that a little bit, Chief?
Yeah, absolutely. It is, first of all, I can update you, and I'm going to give you all a written update as well on the move-up module, because this also falls into that same vein. We've gotten 2 months of data for that move-up module that you all approved a couple of months ago. And in those 2 months, we were able to reduce those move-ups by 87%, which roughly equate across the system about 2,000 calls. So that's 2,000 calls that we eliminated from the system with the same, if not even better, response times. And I only mention that because that is exactly the avenue that we need to go down, because we are so far behind on capital investments. The fire service is more than just fire. We are an all hazards response service that has the responsibility to protect both mobile folks that move around, just like PD, but then we also protect fixed assets that stay in place when those folks go to downtown and go shopping. So we have to be able to do both at the same time. One of the biggest issues is what we call unit reliability, which is basically how many times when I call a fire station, let's say Station 72 on 6th Street, are they available for that call, or are they committed already to another incident? And that's what we're seeing here in the downtown area, is that a lot of our downtown engines are on calls simultaneously, requiring resources from further away to cover those responses. And when we've analyzed those, and this is actually true for the American Fire Service, I think it's very important that people understand that, is that society in general has begun to rely on the fire service across the nation for a greater variety of services that they demand, and low acuity medical emergencies are part of that. And you're absolutely correct that most fire departments still take the big fire engine to deal with those because we are the primary emergency medical services provider here in Prescott. It is much smarter for us, and we're working right now with our regional dispatch center to install what's called ProQA, which is an emergency medical dispatch software that allows us to triage which incidents we can divert to one of those resources without increasing the overall risk to our patients in the pre-hospital environment. And there definitely are some. I don't want to quote a percentage, but I can tell you probably that roughly 10 to 15% just by base estimate are calls that we can divert to those other resources, which is exactly why those investments for Station 72 are in there.
And when you say those other resources, can you talk about what those look like?
Yeah, and right now this is fairly early on in the stages, and actually Mark and I have talked about this because I want to make sure that when we implement that solution, it hits a target that is objective and that I can report really good movement on that goal. But it would look like something, either a pickup truck or something on the back of an ambulance, where we go and we actually interview those patients, not just in the immediate need, but also, for instance, folks that are homebound. Sometimes we run on them 20 to 30 times in 3 months. What else can we do to connect them with better services so that we don't have to always use the 911 system to solve that problem? I think that's just smart, but it's also very responsible, because some folks might say, well, let's just outsource that to a private entity. Well, when we take an oath to protect, we have the duty, in my opinion, to make sure that those folks get the proper service, and that's one way to do that.
And to your point, I know there's been studies where hospitals have done work to make sure they're resourcing patients that are being discharged with the appropriate resources so that they don't become frequent flyers within the hospital system. And so I think looking at that is a very interesting avenue to kind of manage the call response time as well.
That's
Thank you.
correct. Yep.
Councilman Gambogi.
Mark, could you go back to that sales rate tax by community? Now, you're an accountant, right?
I believe so.
And I'm an engineer. So
Congratulations.
when it comes to calculating square root of cosine, I'd probably defer to me. But when it comes to adding it, I would defer to you. So just for, I think I figured this out. On that bottom bar graph, Prescott says 0.75. I was wondering, how did you add 0.75 to 8.35 and come out to 9.3? But is that your 0.95 tax?
That's adding the little blue
Just
to
so-
the side.
so-
You'll see it goes to 9.1 after that retires.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I see under projected operating needs, there's projected 16 new sworn police officers to be put on the street. And I was going to ask Chief Holger how many fire personnel are projected to be put on the street out in the community.
So the current model that we have in front of you initially started with 15 overall positions, and we've modified that into 12 and a half for both stations. And that's to accommodate for coverage factors. There are, of course, other needs. When you add firefighters, you also need to add support staff. We've sharpened the pencil a little bit on that, but it's in order for us to staff an engine company at 3 people a day, minimum staffing, plus coverage positions for vacations, sick leave, injuries, and those types of things, so you're not accumulating too much overtime. So all in all, in this initiative that you see here, it's roughly a net add of 25 uniformed firefighters over the course of the tax. And then there's other general fund support positions that go around that we flushed out of this to be as specific to an impact on our taxpayers when we're asking for an increase in funding.
Okay, thank you. Excellent.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. So, Mark, in our last study session, you made a comment that I've told several people, and I just want to make sure it's correct. Because one of the things I think it's very important for the public and the taxpayers to understand that 61%, I think you told me, of the sales tax revenue is actually paid by outsiders or, visitors and people that live outside of our municipality, tourists, and other people. So in a sense, they're helping us pay for this debt that we're going to have to incur.
Yes, that's our estimates based on the data. It varies from 60 to 65 depending on the time of the year.
That's significant. That's darn good. So the other thing that, again, just for anybody who cares, doesn't matter, but the debt issuance is huge. And if you're talking about 50% reduction, it looks like, with the 0.95 in the debt service over an extended amount of time, because you went to 38, I believe. What was it?
Yeah, we're going from 56 million being borrowed over 30 years to 28.5 being borrowed for only 10 years. So that's why there's such a significant reduction of $38 million in interest savings between those two.
Right, but that again, that's a savings of almost a cost of a fire station.
Yeah, two.
Or
38
two.
million.
That's exactly right. You're right. So, I know it's not going to be popular, but it makes a lot of sense to me just on the savings alone to go with the 0.95. These numbers just make so much more sense in the long run. So anyway, but I did just want to point out to make sure the public understands how much of this is people helping us pay this down by spending their money in Prescott. So thank you.
And again, it's an it's a great point, Mayor Pro Tem. But I mean, again, just these people, just because they're not citizens, doesn't mean they're not taking advantage of these services. They live on the outside of Prescott, but they shop here, they drive here, they recreate here. So it's a way to make the people using the services pay for the services.
Councilman Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. My question, Mark, regarding kind of along the same lines, in the non-sunsetting scenarios, it certainly looks more reasonable to go to a 0.80 tax versus the 0.75 tax. But when we add in the sunset and the additional on the front end, it looks like the math works better to go to the 0.75 instead of the 0.80. Is that a factor of the reduction in the debt? I would assume as much, but I just want to confirm that.
Correct. It's the factor that we're paying more cash capital and we're only issuing loans for 10 years and being able to pay those off. So it's that savings of $38 million that allows the 0.75 to work.
Yeah, I would agree with Mayor Pro Tem in this instance that, I don't love going to that higher level of 0.95 personally, but I like the idea that we're, again, I'm thinking of how we frame this as a narrative to people. And I think one of the things that I've consistently heard is that people want to see that we're going to pay down, that we'll sunset the capital costs. And I think while it's a little kind of more nuanced than that in the sunset scenario you've laid out for me, I think it's pretty easy to say that because of the timing, we're borrowing on a 10-year schedule to pay capital costs. When that 10-year note of that borrowing is up, then that will sunset. I think that's a way that we can simply kind of convey that story to people who might not be as patient as the rest of the folks in this room to sit through this presentation. So I like that idea. I'm in favor of it. I was entered into even today with some skepticism around implementing in sunset, but it looks like it pencils out to me. Thank you.
Councilmember Rusi.
Thank you. Mark, I have a question about the ARC annual required contribution with the increase in staffing. I assume that's going to be going up, and we're going to be continuing to pay that out of the general fund and not out of the public safety tax.
Again, the general fund is still paying a majority of the public safety costs. ARC, the annual required contribution, is just the annual pension cost. Since Prescott and the citizens were able to put that tax in and bring the unfunded liability down, the ARC for the public safety is 12-13% a year as retirement cost benefit, similar to Arizona State retirement. That is included in these projections of the new employees. I mean, that huge ARC we had, Councilwoman, is gone with the retirement of the...
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Councilwoman Farworth.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to move on to the language being proposed and based upon input that I've heard. One of the things that I understand people are worried about is that we would be using this sales tax initiative and eventually chipping away at our current funding from the general fund to the police so that we could buy other things. So I would love to see, even though these numbers don't show us doing that, I would love to see some kind of language on the ballot initiative that makes that crystal clear to the public when they're voting, because they're not going to be looking at these spreadsheets. I would love to see something to the effect that current funding to cover current police and fire will not degrade over time. I love the fact that you have worded in here in Section 2 that the transaction privilege tax contribute to the general fund for the sole purpose. I don't know if we can underline, star, explanation point, sole purpose of funding public safety services. So the combination of that sentence some way more clearly highlighted and adding some definition to the fact that we are not going to chip away at their current funding, I think is the magic combination that the public will need to more clearly understand the 99.99% of citizens that haven't listened to one moment of these deliberations. So that'd be my suggestions for the ballot initiative, whether it's a whereas or whether it's a, when you get to the language of the ballot initiative itself, I think we have to make those points in these paragraphs.
So we don't generally put whereases in ballot language, or bold or underline or highlight.
Thank you. I was looking at the ordinances. Okay.
The ballot language itself is just this portion that Mark has highlighted on here, and then the summary, a yes vote or a no vote, is what we utilize to explain to the voters what they're casting their ballot for. We could, I would think, Joe, you and I could come up with something that would kind of more specifically address some of those things within the ordinance itself, but that would not be within the ballot language.
Yeah, I was going to say, ultimately, this is a public policy decision. What the ballot language says is up to you. We drafted the kind of a simple as we can version of that. But I think the question that you're presenting, that the current amount they're getting not be reduced, is something that we can include, and it should be in the enacting ordinance, the draft ordinance you have before you. But we can put that in the ordinance, and it's still an ordinance of the city obligating that. And I don't know if it's a percentage of the general fund or if it's an amount that we currently give that shall not be reduced.
I love putting it in the ordinance, so thank you for considering that. But I am still worried about the 99.999% of the voters that will never, they don't attend meetings, they don't listen to videos, and they're certainly not going to read an ordinance buried on the website. So I would love to see the revenue from which will be contributed to the city's general fund for the sole purpose of funding within the city without any degradation to current funding to public safety. Some words that lets them see what they're buying.
Councilman Gambogi.
We might change the spelling of S-O-L-E, soul, to S-O-U-L. I wanted to say that this has been a great educational experience. I wanted to thank Chief Holger, Chief Amy, and Mark for learning a lot. I don't think anybody up here wants to sit here and say we want to raise taxes. That's not what we want to do. But I came here fully prepared to take the side of Occam's razor, and I thought the simplest solution was one tax. but I see that I was wrong because I asked Mark. Mark, at the Occam's razor was 0.8. That kind of brought us to break even at the end of the period. But the interest cost that I learned from Mark was 45 mil.
Total on the previous one, 38 million more than the
38 million more than at 0.95 and then dropping it to 0.75. I think also, Mark emphasized this a number of times. There's a lot of assumptions, which means we don't have a condition of ceteris paribus. A lot of things can change. Construction costs can change. Inflation costs can change. We have a workforce housing element. That's not in this budget. It's got to go somewhere if we do it. Where we put stations, we haven't really engaged with the community to develop a synergistic approach to this where we get with developers and find out a way how we could put stations somewhere and drive the cost down. That's still unknown. That 60% figure that we love to preach, that outsiders pay for our funding, that could be a variable too, because if our sales tax goes up above PV, then PV may not drive the Prescott to shop. So with that in mind, I'm a bigger fan of getting that debt paid off quicker rather than later. That's kind of a political term, isn't it? And so I know I'm gonna get grief for this, but I'd be in favor of the 0.95 and then dropping it to 7.5. I, like Montoya, thought this sunsetting thing was a political ploy, but the numbers speak for themselves.
Councilman Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. I had a question, and Sarah, you may be able to answer this, but I know that city staff can't, but individuals or private citizens can make arguments for or against this proposition. And as I understand, there's a fee associated with that. Can you talk to that a little bit?
There is. So once you all make a determination on what you want the ballot language to look like, I would bring forward a finalized version of one of the variations of the draft ordinance that you've all seen today. That would be at the May 14th meeting, if we can come to consensus today. Once that ballot language is adopted, we open up an argument filing period that allows citizens to submit arguments for or against a ballot measure or a proposition, and it's a $200 fee that's associated with that, and that goes toward fees for publishing the publicity pamphlet and staff time and all that kind of stuff.
And so I guess, Sarah, let me ask this a little bit more directly. I know that city staff can't get involved in that process, but if I were to, as a public citizen, decide to pay that, donate half of my stipend from city council for a month to make an argument for this, I could do so freely and kind of lay out. Because I know, to Lois's point, people aren't going to go and look at the ordinance. I totally agree. But one thing I think and I think we have a very good electorate in this community that does look at things really carefully. So I know that when I look at propositions, especially state propositions, the first thing I'll look at is I'll read through the ballot language, and then I'll go through and look at who's arguing for and against it and what the rationale is. So I think that's something to consider, that if we as private citizens, the 7 of us up here, were to make arguments for it, that might carry some weight too.
Yes, definitely. You all can do that, and should if you choose to do so. The arguments are contained within the publicity pamphlet. So, it's that booklet that you get that comes kind of right around the same time that you get your ballot. And it will have all of that in there. So it would appear like this, and then it would have all the information regarding any arguments that we receive included in that as well.
And there's a word limit, I assume, right?
There is. I don't know it off the top of my head.
That's okay. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks.
Attorney Young, can you and I talked about the ability for the members of council to be able to advocate for our decision on this ballot proposition. And there are a certain amount of restrictions. But if we follow the guidelines, we should be able to advocate for this, or at least be able to explain it as much as we have the opportunity to do, because as you've seen from the members of council here, it's somewhat complicated. When we talk about the funding and the sunsetting and the reduction in debt load, interest, being able to retire that, those are all components that will take some explanation to the average voter. So could you describe what we can and can't do?
Yeah, just as a basic rule, city funds cannot be used to advocate a position on a ballot initiative. So that brings up the question, well, what can be done? And as elected officials, you can kind of do whatever you want in terms of campaigning for a ballot initiative, except you can't use city resources. So you wouldn't be able to, for example, take staff during staff time to help out, to advocate for a position. You couldn't use a city resource like this building to advocate for a position. But otherwise, you're free to campaign or do as you see fit. Now, in terms of staff time can be used to help compile information that is informational in nature. So, and I think that's your question. Can staff compile information that's informational in nature? And yes, staff can. Although there's a line there, and that line moves, where it becomes so much time spent compiling information that it leads towards advocacy. And I can't here on this dais say where that is, but it's just something to keep in mind.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I just want to, so we don't get off on this like that's happened in the past with the voting thing. Should we try to figure out, Mayor, this is for you, is there anybody on the dais that would be opposed to sunsetting? Maybe we should figure that out first before we proceed with the vote.
There's no vote.
Well, to have a consensus, let's say. I mean, because have we established that? I mean, I'm fine with the sunset. I think it's needed. I'm fine with what Ted said, the 0.95. I prefer to pay fewer dollars, if you will, on the debt. So I guess if we have to get a consensus, we'd probably need to figure out if we can move forward and what we're going to be moving forward on. Thank you.
Well, I'd be happy to poll the members of the council at this point. I think Councilman Gambogi, you've made your position known.
0.95, 0.75.
And Mayor Pro Tem,
Same.
Councilmember Rusing.
I like the sunset option, 0.95 and 7.75.
Councilwoman Furworth.
I like the sunset option.
Councilman Moore, I'm not sure if you have been able to follow our deliberations here. But
I know I had another commitment today.
Yeah.
But yes, I agree with that option. Thank you.
And Councilman Montoya.
I'm going to keep up the consistency here and be with the sunset as well. I think I think it's the option that makes the most sense to me, Mayor.
Well, I know I originally was considering the sunset clause as an absolute requirement in my mind for a good tax policy. And that was even before I found out how much we were going to save by retiring that bond issue earlier. So I'm even more strongly in favor of it today.
Mayor, if I could, we very much appreciate as staff the direction we're getting. It's very clear we're moving forward with the language before us. However, I know that Councilwoman Fruworth had some suggestions on amending this language to be a little more explicit on not utilizing current general fund resources or degrading those or eroding those. I think it'd be beneficial if council had that discussion on if staff's bringing this language before you on the screen, or are we bringing some amended language to the May 14th meeting?
Well, I know we have a variety of government functions that are coming out of the general fund, although about 76% already go to police and fire. But we have library services, we have general government, parks and recreation. So do we establish a percentage that doesn't change going into the future? But if we do that, then we can't modify some of the budget allocations to that. I know right now we're dealing with the county trying to cut the amount of library service funding that's coming from them. And if that continues, then we either have to cut services at the library or increase the amount coming to from the general fund for that. So that's an example of an unanticipated financial consequence that if we lock these numbers into the future, we wouldn't be able to modify.
I agree with you, Mayor. Just from my standpoint, the language before us is very clear that it's for the sole purpose of funding public safety services. I'll let Mark speak to the details. It does get complicated when you start placing restrictions, percentage or solid dollar amounts. It can change very quickly on you.
Thank you, Tyler. It can get really complicated and really problematic quick. As you know, our friends at the state legislature always like to change our tax base. We have a big chunk of our general fund, which we'll be covering on the 9th for the public. We'll have a budget workshop on the 9th of May. Please attend. We will cover these things. So $7-8 million of our general fund comes from service charges. So to say a percentage goes to police and fire kind of ignores that fact. So you would have to try to tie it to excise taxes, state shared revenues, and those things. But again, you have those fluctuating as the state manipulates percentages and those type of things. You know, we tried, when we put this together, we knew council's concern, we knew the public's concern, and that's why we used the wording that we did. So obviously staff felt it was sufficient, but if council wants something else, I guess we need a little more direction, and we'll try to avoid any problems.
And I know from my perspective, just as a matter of policy making, there's a reason that you set a budget every year. And every year you reanalyze where we're at. And so binding kind of future councils, there's things that you're bound to do by past councils, and it doesn't feel good. And I don't think it's really necessarily good policy. And that's kind of one of the concerns. I think that, though, to the extent this is a policy decision, and if you want to set some way that it doesn't go below a certain point of the current general fund budget, we can do that. We'd have to spend some time figuring out how that looks. And there's obviously some reluctance to do that just based on all those factors Mark and Tyler and I have talked about.
Councilman Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. I understand Lois's ethic where she's coming from in wanting to make sure that, you know, we kind of are really putting a fine point on that. This is a dedicated tax to that. I am concerned, like the mayor, about unintended consequences around this. And I tend to agree. I think the way the language is written for me feels clear enough. I do think we do have a budget process, and beyond that, future councils have something that is the ultimate form of accountability, which are elections. So if a future council gets over their skis on trying to, you know, get their hands in the cookie jar of the sales tax, voters can vote them out. And I have confidence in the voters that they'll do so if they think that's necessary. I think this is good enough for me. I'd be curious if there was a way to sharpen it without going too far. Like, I guess that's my big concern. I do want to, you know, make it really clear to the general public that this is a dedicated sales tax to public safety. But I think implicit in moving forward with this is that it's not like this money's going to start rolling in and then we're going to say to Holger and Amy, hey, sorry, we know we talked about doing additional fire stations, but we don't want to do that now. That would not make sense. You know, implicit in this is that staff is going to start factoring into capital improvement project budgets and yearly budgets that this is in the works. So I think that's the ultimate form of accountability, and I think the debt issuance as well is probably kind of that feels like enough to me. You know, and I think the unintended consequences really gives me concern about hemming in the language too much. So that's just my perspective, Mayor.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I have a question just to put a perspective on this for the public. This tax will not free up any money in the general fund for other uses, right?
That's not what was proposed. That's not how it is presented, for sure. I mean, again, there's a lot of unknowns as we look out into the future, but public safety will continue to need facilities and people, and council will continue to talk about it and emphasize it as part of budget workshops into the future. So no, it would not. It's not intended to. I can't speak to the people that come after us who are in this room, but I would assume that would continue on.
Well, if we make it more complicated, you have to stay in your job, Mark, for at least another 15 years.
Another 15.
Councilwoman Furworth.
Oh, no.
Thank you. I would be very interested in public comments on this question. Again, I've been out talking to a lot of members of the public for the last 2 weeks. I think our job, if things got rough and tough down the road, is always to prioritize basic services, which the public thinks of as police, roads, fire. That's about it. Water, sorry. I knew there was one more. I just couldn't remember. Water and sewer. So again, I'm going to push for the purposes of selling this and getting it across the line. I do think we need to talk about that this would not degrade funding to the basic services of how this city operates. We've got to put that language in there so that they can trust that it will be upheld. And without it, then it's going to come down to personalities and opinions and rumors and innuendos, and I hate to see any of that happening because this is so important that I'm trying to offset that happening for the next few months. So I'm going to encourage it. I will go along at the end with what the public wants us to do, but I really think they want us to prioritize the basic services and police and fire at the top of that list.
Mayor Pro Tem.
So, along that thought process, I also agree that it's pretty clear there with the word soul, whether it's S-O-L-E or S-O-U-L. But if we want to make it, there is this thing out in the world that everybody has a 3-second soundbite. A lot of people will read the first line. What if we just put in front of transaction just the word dedicated? Where's Mark? With a dedicated transaction privilege. I mean, it's pretty clear. And that way, if they don't get all the way down to the word soul, they can see that it's dedicated. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, dedicated. I mean, it kind of says that already. So if you want to just move words around, I mean, we can.
Just want to grab that 3 seconds.
So if I could, I'm hearing kind of a concern that's more in my mind on the back end of what happens with the other general funds that are currently allocated to police and fire. It's not so much, I don't think the concern, it's pretty clear that these dollars will be for the sole purpose of police and fire, but then what does city management, what does council then do with the funds that would theoretically be offset? I think we've made it clear that they will not be offset. In fact, Mark's slides show that 40 million of the 60 million in year 10 will come from normal general fund funds.
And our projections did include that, but again, the projections aren't binding, but the ballot is. But there just isn't money available. The public safety costs will continue to go up. You are not going to be able to maintain the public safety level that this council and probably future councils want and reduce the other funding out of the general fund there. But, whatever we can do to make it as clear as possible, I guess.
I think dedicated is the word.
I like that too, Mayor Pro Tem. It's small but focused description of how this tax is going to be used. Councilman Moore?
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to comment that I appreciate Kathy's question just a few moments ago about how this tax will not affect the funding like create more funding for other departments. I think it's really important, that the public understands that the purpose of doing this tax is to protect those other services that we provide in our city, because if we don't pass this tax, then we are going to be forced to cut services, whether it's in park and recreation or library or in other areas of the city. And so I just think that's the point that we need to drive home to our citizens, that this is imperative. Summer things are nice to have, and I'm a big advocate for open space and trails and parks and all that stuff in a library, but this has to come first. And if we don't do this, then it's going to affect other things, which is a situation we were finding ourselves in several years ago with PSPRS, where we were having brownouts on fire stations and stuff because we couldn't afford it.
Councilmember Rusing.
Oh, I just had a suggestion. After transaction privilege tax, could we put in parentheses just sales tax? So it kind of simplifies things so people know what they're talking about, what we're talking about, and they don't get it confused with the bed tax or some other property tax or something. If we just put simple sales tax in parentheses.
And I don't mean to be a pain. Arizona doesn't have a sales tax. We do that kind of reference, like in the budget workshops. Whether putting that in a ballot is a good idea, I would defer to legal, because this is not a sales tax, it's a transaction privilege tax. Sales tax is just on products, where this is also on some level of service, whether it's entertainment, whether it's commercial rentals or any of that. It's not a transaction sales. It's not a sales tax. It's a transaction privilege tax. But I'd defer to legal, maybe in quotes.
I think that's something we have to look at, to be honest.
And I understand the council's desire for specificity when we're talking about the ballot language, but I think it's also very important for you all to understand that this ballot measure is going to be at the bottom of what is anticipated to be one of the lengthiest general election ballots that our state has ever seen. And so if we are getting so specific with the ballot language at the end of an already very long ballot, voter fatigue lends to a no vote. If we're getting so specific that it's almost confusing it further, if that makes sense. So I would caution continually adding additional language with the goal of providing more specifics to the public. We can certainly, that would be a good argument for or against if somebody was going to submit something what this privilege tax really covers. And also, like Mark said, it's not technically a sales tax, so that complicates it even further. So that's just a suggestion that I have.
Thank you.
Can we pay to have it higher up on the ballot?
I wish.
Not with city funds.
Councilman Gambogi.
I think we're getting down in the weeds when they're worried about trying to get voters to read the ballot. I think the more important thing is most people are visual or audio learners. So I think it's incumbent upon us, if we believe this is good and true, that we need to get out to the community and share with them just exactly what the situation is, what it looks like down the road if we do nothing, and then communicate with them. We've been on the radio twice. We're scheduling more community efforts or community organization presentations. I think we just got to go work it, and then we take advantage of the word of mouth that's how this community works a little bit more than reading ballot language.
Councilwoman Furworth.
Yes, question. Sarah, good point, good push. So now I'm looking at the ballot language and I'm bored by the second paragraph. Is it possible to say a yes vote shall have the effect of adopting the above transaction privilege tax as outlined? A no vote will maintain the current transaction privilege tax in Prescott with the understanding that budget tough choices, something like that, are going to have to be made. I mean, things are going to go away. We're not going to be able to afford the needs versus the wants. I mean, the wants versus the needs. Something a lot simpler than repeating the first paragraph in essence 3 times.
Yeah, so generally speaking, the summation on a yes vote, a no vote, is to repeat the ballot language. It's not a requirement, but Joe and I can work together on kind of simplifying that a little bit, but still making sure that we're covering what we have to by election law.
Thank you. And that's my concern, is a no vote, keeping tax the same, will require hard choices in budgets about, going forward. And I think the public needs to read that when they're voting no. We need to be able to, future councils need to be able to say, we were clear the implications in the ballot if you voted no, and here it is.
Well, I think we've come to a conclusion here. Are there any additional concerns we need?
We just have some public comment. Mayor,
Public
if you'd like
comment.
to take that. Okay. The first card I have is from Kenneth Fiddick.
Good afternoon. Ken Fiddick, Soaring Avenue, Prescott, Arizona. Great discussion. I've only changed my comments 6 times in the last hour and a half. So I'm going to try to redo it. Lois mentioned trust. Connie mentioned dedicated. Ted changed soul to S-O-U-L. Maybe it should be all caps, sole purpose in all caps, if that's not a violation of law or ordinance. So I voted for most of you on the council. So in some form, I need to have some faith in your ultimate decisions. But money is money. And the people in this community are going to look at that very closely. The word will get out. I don't care where it is on the ballot. Word will get out. What's the dollar impact of this? There's nothing in that language about the dollar impact. Maybe that is or is not allowed. I don't know. But I think that should be considered, at least by you folks. What's the dollar impact to the community? Because we don't have the spreadsheets. We don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. Number 2, I used to say trust but verify. Now I say don't trust but verify, even if I voted for you. So I don't know if a fire station's $10.5 million, or is that an average of 3 bids? Is that a wild guess? Is that based on some historical fact? I don't know if a new police station is $29 million. Okay, so I am taking a little bit on you folks on trust or faith, but I like to know that you've dug into this deeply to validate those numbers on the capital budget. I'd also like to know if we have a strategic plan for the city, not just a yearly operating plan, and maybe I just need to look further on the website for that. And how does this marry in with the general plan of 25 years? Is this all encompassing? Is this new to the general plan? Is this already going to be factored in? Is this something? So I'd like to see that they're all aligned. And let me see if I have one last comment. Oh, I heard that 76% for police and fire or critical public safety. 70%, 76% is a good number. I heard 60 or 61% of outsiders providing funding for our unofficial sales tax or privilege tax, whatever you want to call it. So my last comment would be, I come from the corporate sector. Some of you on council came from corporate. No matter what your budget was, the powers to be above you might have said, cut 10%. And you thought you were pretty much there. So if I said to the council, cut 10% of your current budget, where would that be from? I don't expect you to answer today, but I'd expect you to look at the capital budget, the operating budget, and say, okay, if you had to cut 10%, what would you eliminate today? And does that change what you're going to propose in a tax in the future? Thank you.
Elizabeth Howe?
Good afternoon. My name is Betsy Howe. I live at 834 Weston Pass. I would like to say I am just so impressed by how you work together, discuss together the background that we've seen. So I'd like to think I'm part of that 0.1% that actually pays attention, but obviously there's a lot of thought that's gone into this. And I came in here today and I just underscored the sunset clause. I think you have developed a lot of trust within the community because of what you did with the retirement funds, that you raised the money, you honored the sunset clause, and I think that is something that you can ride on. It might be a political ploy, but this is a factor of trying to get voters to vote. So it sounds like that's the direction you're headed in. But I think for a lot of reasons, the fact that you are sunsetting the capital portion of this and letting the voters know that you really can't sunset the other because we in fact have more of a commitment to the operating expense is a very strong statement to the voters. And I thank you for that.
Sherry Hanna?
Thank you. Sherry Hanna, 2503 Willow Creek Road. So I just want to thank, I know a lot of hard work went into this. We've been visiting with our attorney and our city clerk and everybody to make sure that the best we could bring forth right now to the public. I think overall, everybody wants to support police and fire. They want to make sure they have what they have. And I think the most important part, like everybody said, it's going to be critical, the wording. I know I don't want to beat a dead horse, but even hearing from everybody, and just got a text walking in here from someone said, make sure that wording protects the money for only police and fire. And I know that you don't want to make it too long, but we really have to make sure that that's going to be done in the wording. And I know Councilman Montoya said, well, if somebody gets in the cookie jar, you vote them out. Well, that you can do that, but the public will not be forgiving to us. And they will say, that's your fault. You guys should have made sure that they could not do that. So and like I said, I know it's going to be hard, but really concentrate on making sure that that cannot be touched. Also, for anything else but police and fire. And then also the other point was brought up that it will not affect, the generated tax will not affect their regular budget that they're allowed to have in there. So protecting that too. And I think the big thing is going to be the sticker shock on the 0.95%. When they first see that, not understanding that it will sunset, but I didn't really think people will think, wow, I thought it was going to be 8% at the most or something. But so that'll be up to us or you and everybody to because they're not here to see what we all saw, and the great presentation that Mr. Whitfield gave us on why that this is the best scenario, and you all agree to that. So other than that, I just want to thank you, and we'll just move forward to the next session and hopefully be a little better wording in there on protecting the money for just police and fire. So thank you.
That's all, Mayor.
Well, very good. I think we've analyzed this pretty darn effectively, and I'm very, very pleased that the members of the council recognize the need for sunsetting the capital portion of this. We do have individual obligations to get out to the public and be able to explain this, deal with the public's questions so they can be thoroughly answered and understood. So that's going to be a obligation that we'll all have to take on. And I think for the future of the city, being able to make sure that everyone has equal protection of the law and equal opportunity to be serviced by our public safety in a prompt and effective way is, again, one of the things I think is the most legitimate reason to have government, is to be able to provide effective public safety. So with that said, this meeting is adjourned.